I'm not going to go into all the detail. I'll just share the general definition to clarify how robbery and looting and thievery are different things. So robbery means the taking of money or other property, which may be the subject of larceny, from the person or custody of another, larceny being a thieving, with intent to permanently or temporarily deprive the person owner of the money or property, when in the course of the taking, there is the use of force, violence, or assault, or putting in fear. So the robber, for it to be robbery, you're threatening somebody. There's a personal interaction. An armed robber would be the classic example, right? They step out from an alley, they point a gun at you, they say, give me your wallet or I'll shoot you. Well, they're using force, violence, assault, putting in fear to facilitate the taking of the property. That's different than if they were a pickpocket, right? They're still stealing, still larceny, but they're not using force, violence, assault, or putting in fear, arguably. So robbery requires this personal interaction. If a gang of people go into a store and unlawfully grab racks of clothes and roll them out of the store for the purpose of converting those clothes to their own use, right? They're stealing for sure. There's no question about it. But they don't threaten anybody with force, violence, assault, or putting in fear, then arguably that's not a robbery because that personal interaction did not occur. What would it be if it's not a robbery? Well, Florida has a law about that too. There is, of course, the crime of theft, which is merely converting other person's property to your own purpose. Taking control and possession of someone else's property unlawfully. That would simply be thievery, larceny, theft. It doesn't require a personal interaction. It's a different crime than robbery. Robbery is basically the thievery with this threat of violence, with that personal interaction. But retail theft has always been put in its own unique category, has its own unique provisions. And the Florida law on retail theft in particular was recently updated within the last couple of years to reflect the increasing frequency of these large-scale mobs going into stores and pillaging them. And this is that Florida statute. 812.015, retail and farm theft. So they start with a bunch of definitions. Retail theft means the taking possession of or carrying away of merchandise, property, money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or removing a shopping cart with intent to deprive the merchant of possession, use, benefit, or full retail value. So that's what's happening in these cases, right? It's retail theft. And then Florida got tired of the large-scale organized retail theft rings, so they started adding in, let's see, let's see if they define the basic retail theft. So a simple individual shoplifting, right? First time offender. Petty theft under a certain dollar amount. Upon a second or subsequent conviction, I don't see where it says first conviction. Maybe they give you a pass on the first one. A fine of not less than $50, not more than $1,000. May be required to do public service. I don't even see anything about any jail time, much less prison time. But let's see, where is the section I'm looking for? Oh, here we go. But everything pops up to a felony level if, let's see. Well, I'll go straight to this bottom section. I saw it there. Oh, this is the first one. So a person who commits a retail theft commits a felony in the third degree if the person individually or in concert with one or more other persons coordinates the activities. So it's an organized retail theft ring. It bumps things up from, a simple shoplifting was nothing. I mean, it was a fine. Now it's a third degree felony if it's part of an organized crime ring. Let's see. What do you get for a third degree felony? 5 years, up to 5 years in prison for a third degree felony. And then If you're part of an organized in concert with one or more other persons, you take property in excess of $3,000, then it becomes a second-degree felony. And I believe second-degree felony is good for 30 years. Let me take a look. Uh, 15 years for a second-degree felony and a $10,000 fine. So quite a bit more than, $50 to $1,000 without even any jail time, right? Third-degree felony, second-degree felony. But there's nothing here about the privileged use of deadly defensive force to prevent this from happening. It's not a robbery, which is what Trump was speaking to, because there's no interaction with persons required for this crime. And there's no provision for and it's not one of the enumerated forcible felonies under Florida law. Here. And if there's no interaction, which is what we're presuming to differentiate this from robbery, it's not a felony which involves the use or threat of physical force or violence against an individual, right? They're just walking in and walking out with the merchandise. So that wouldn't privilege under Florida law the use of deadly defensive force by anybody. Then we get to the question of what actually is looting. Some states define looting explicitly, but many states, I find, define looting as a form of burglary. Here we have Florida's statute on burglary. Now, the thing with burglary is that it's a taking of property from within some kind of structure or vessel. So it's a home, a dwelling, some kind of enclosed structure, or it could sometimes be a vehicle, a car, a truck, a ship, I guess. And so someone has to intrude into that structure for the purpose of committing some other crime, typically a taking of property. If there's no invasion of the structure, there's no burglary, right? So if you just left a piece of property out in your front yard and someone steals it, they still committed a crime, but they did not commit a burglary. Well, imagine if there was, and also I should point out that another characteristic of looting is it's generally defined as being within the context of some kind of natural disaster, and people are taking advantage of the natural disaster, or it could be a riot, some kind of broad event. And people are taking advantage of the lack of normal structure, law enforcement, the overwhelming of society's normal protections against property theft. Looters are people who are stealing property in that circumstance. Okay. Now you could imagine that there was flooding or a hurricane, and somebody in Florida had piled up emergency water supplies, bottles of water on pallets in their backyard. Well, if someone comes and tries to steal those pallets, and then the homeowner, the neighborhood's evacuated, the pallets of water are left there. And while the homeowner's away, some stranger from outside the community comes, sees the water, steals the water. I would argue they're looting. They're converting property in the context of that natural disaster that debilitates society's normal means of protecting property, right? They're taking advantage of the natural disaster for the purpose of theft. But they're not committing a burglary. They didn't enter a structure. So burglary and looting are not necessarily the same things. Of course, it is often the case that looting and burglary do overlap. If someone's committing the looting, the theft of the property in the context of a natural disaster, and they're entering structures to do that, I'd argue they're committing both looting and burglary because of the entry of the structure. So how Florida deals with the question of looting is it includes it within the context of burglary, which means there is a structural entry required here for this particular flavor of looting that they're talking about. So, and they just, so they've had different versions of the statutes, and some versions apply before and after certain dates. But the after is after 2001, so we'll take a look at that one. A burglary means entering a dwelling, a structure, or a conveyance with the intent to commit an offense therein. Usually this is a property crime, but it doesn't have to be a property crime. It could be some other offense. Or notwithstanding that you were licensed, The person entering did not have license to enter. So they're entering unlawfully, right? For the purpose of committing some other offense. Or even if they entered lawfully into the dwelling, structure, or conveyance, they surreptitiously, with the intent to commit an offense, after permission to remain has been withdrawn, or to commit some forcible felony. I mean, we've already read through the forcible felonies, right? But all three of these scenarios, they entered surreptitiously after permission to remain has been withdrawn. They stayed, or they're there to commit a forcible felony, not merely some offense, but a forcible felony. But all of these have in common entering a dwelling, a structure, or a conveyance. And then we have different degrees of burglary. Burglary is a felony in the first degree if it's done while armed. And first degree felony in Florida is good for 30 years. What if you're not armed? Well, burglary is a felony of the second degree under a variety of scenarios, one of which is the burglary is committed during a riot or an aggravated riot prohibited under the law, and the perpetration of the burglary is facilitated by conditions arising from the riot, or within a county that is subject to a state of emergency declared by the governor after blah, 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 blah. And the perpetration of the burglary is facilitated by the conditions arising from the emergency. The burglary is a felony of the first degree. So if you commit what would normally be a second degree burglary under conditions of riot or state of emergency, natural disaster, it bumps it up from a second degree burglary, 15 years max, to a first degree burglary, 30 years, first degree felony, 30 years max. Then they have, and that's the general scope for a burglary committed not with a weapon, but while someone is present in the structure. An innocent person is present in the structure. There's a lesser degree of burglary if it's committed and there's no one inside the structure. That's normally a third degree felony, but it's bumped. So a third degree was what we just looked, right? 5 years. But this third degree felony is bumped up to a second degree felony if this burglary is committed, no one's in the structure, but it's committed in the context of a riot or a state of emergency. So it bumps it up from a 5-year felony to a 15-year felony. So, and much of this law was actually, it was changed recently. Let's see. I think it was changed in 2021. Let me go back here. Yeah, so we have this change here, April 19th, 2021, and that's reflected here. So this is the bill that went through the legislature that changed the burglary statute. 810.02 is Florida's burglary statute. The parts in green are the new language, and you can see that that's where is reflected during a riot or an aggravated riot. State of emergency, I guess, was already there, but they added the riot provisions because of Antifa and BLM rioting all over the place, right? So they bumped up those versions of burglaries from lower degree felonies to higher degree felonies. So looting as a form of burglary. Well, let's take a look back at now the question would be, these organized retail theft mobs were 30 people, 100 people go into the store and clean it out. There's no state of emergency, let's presume, currently declared. So that wouldn't result in the escalation of the burglary. Would make it a burglary. I guess it would be a burglary anyway, but it's still treated as covered by retail theft laws because of the organized nature of the theft. But there's no state of emergency. And is it a riot? Is there a riot taking place? Is the entry itself the riot if a particular store is being targeted and not others? Riot, I think of as more generalized disorder in the community, right? Like we see with BLM and Antifa. So unless there's a more generalized riot going on, I don't know that you have these aggravating conditions here, these requirements of riots or state of emergency that would be required for the escalation of these burglaries. And if we look back at the forcible felony definition again, we see that indeed burglary is one of the enumerated forcible felonies for which deadly force could be used. But again, we have to ask the question, the statute actually says to prevent the imminent commission of a forcible felony, to prevent the imminent commission of a burglary. While the burglary is taking place, I guess it's still imminent. But once they're outside the store, are they still engaged in the imminent commission of a burglary? Or is the burglary over? And if it's not still imminent, you wouldn't have this legal privilege to use deadly force to shoot them. So when Trump says, after you've robbed a place, you should expect to get shot, that's a problematic description of what the law allows.